Cool. Let's begin this officially.
All right, let's get to it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah.
My name is Mujib.
And welcome to another episode of Let's Get to It. This is episode 26. And talking about my generation.
You're so cool.
Some generational speak today. I'm stoked for today.
Right. As soon as we got on to the conversation, I realized that you were so stoked about it, and I'm excited to see everything that you dove into, because I didn't dive into it as much as once we started talking about it last time. So I was like, okay, that's a cool idea. And then today I was wondering, like, okay, how's this conversation really going to go? Because it could go so many different ways. And then to jump online with you and have you say, like, oh no, I've really been thinking about it. So I'm excited to jump into that.
I have been thinking about it, just to let our listeners and now viewers know kind of how this podcast works in general. Is it's pretty organic, and basically we don't do a lot of prep and pre-planning beforehand, and usually it's a couple of days before that we kind of land on a topic, and it's pretty organic that way. So either Mujib has something on his mind and we'll go in that direction, or I have something on my mind, and that's kind of how it works. And so I approached him with this idea of talking about our generation. And what is that? We are millennials. Which I'm like, what? We are? Otherwise known as Gen Y. And I just thought it'd be really interesting to explore what that means. And Mujib and I were born pretty much 1 year apart, but we're both 1983 babies. It's just he was born at the beginning of 83 and I was born at the very end of 83. I think we can speak to our own personal experiences, of course, through some of our life milestones, and maybe extrapolate that too, like in terms of this generation that, I don't know, like millennials are super highly criticized, and it's just really interesting. And even if we feel comfortable with that label, how we feel about it, do we feel some connection to Gen Xers? Do we feel any connection to Gen Z? Like where do we fit in? So I just thought it'd be a fun conversation.
Yeah, I as you started mentioning the dates at which they start to delineate those generations, I was thinking about how much I kind of associate the age at which folks are growing up more than the age at which they were born. So like, you said that a millennial might go to 1996. Whereas like I wouldn't have thought that, because I think about somebody as being born in 96 interacting so much with like 2006 as they come of age at 10 years old. And so by 2016, the way that they're thinking is a little bit different than I would think somebody who's born in my generation is, you know what I mean? Just and then that's in that simple sense. It'll be because so much of that is basically how I interact with the whole idea around generation, is that because growing up, I really only thought about it in terms of like my grandmother, my mother, us as kids. My sister, she's oldest sister. She's born in 77. My brother's born in 80. My brother's kind of the cusp of the generations as well.
Yep.
And I think because of that, we all just interacted as if we were the same generation anyway. So I'm influenced by a lot of what was in my house or what my siblings had access to before I had access to it. And when I think about like somebody who was born in 1990, for instance, I don't really see them as being influenced by like the 80s too much, because by the time they are even making sense of the world, it's already 2000. And so,
right.
I wonder about that sort of, so I'm interested to see what you have in mind when it comes to the generations themselves.
Yeah, it is really strange. I've looked into some stuff, which really it takes some care to separate millennials, and particularly to Y.1 and Y.2. And I think part of that is because we were born in the early 80s. We can remember like dialing a phone. Like I had a rotary phone in my house. I don't know if you had a rotary phone, but like literally,
yeah, for a little while.
It wasn't, we are sort of bridged this technology gap. Like so much was happening as we were coming of age, like when the internet was really introduced, and kind of figuring that out for the first time. And so it's just really interesting if being on this weird generational cusp and like having this memory. Like I know when I was coming up, if I wanted to go out with a boy, like I had to call the landline, I had to call the house phone and likely talk to a gatekeeper, which was a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And, hi, Mrs. So-and-so, can I speak to Daniel? It's, I can't imagine not having that experience. Like today, you can just like sext with somebody, and I'm we're not that old, but it just kind of like blows my mind, sort of the access that people have to each other because of technology. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like I remember going to girlfriends' houses for sleepovers, and we'd all have like the phone, and just kind of the fun of like calling someone's house, especially when it came to boys, like calling a boy's house that you were into. Just all of those moments of adolescence.
Wow, yeah.
Which like, getting the butterflies, of just talking on the phone, or, your parents screening your calls. And I don't know. I wouldn't ever not want to have experienced that.
Wow, yeah. I hear that.
Do you remember that?
I'm remembering those things as you're talking about them, I think that when we've mentioned this idea in the past, I've definitely thought about phones, particularly like that's kind of how we engaged around it, very much in the way that you just opened the conversation. So again, I'm excited about where it's going to go. But, I think about that technology itself, the phone, but then like you just described all of the other instances that go around it, and not having any interaction with that as a technology takes an entire kind of experience out of somebody's reality who wasn't born into that. And I'm still kind of at the mentality where I think about that person being so young anyway.
Right.
Like, I'm like, oh, that's such a young person who never had to deal with that tech. But in reality, that person is between 15 and 20 years old now. You know what I mean? And like those kids never dealt with, no, I can't say never, because it's also, there's also the interesting reality around where you grew up and how you grew up and what you had access to too, because like, whereas we didn't really have access to cellular phones until we were like late teens. I had friends who had cell phones earlier than that, so on and so forth. And I bet you some people still have weird little dial-up phones just based on their experience with a grandmother or something like that, or like people that are dealing with those old technologies. And so again, how an older generation can then influence how somebody's interacting with their surroundings and with what they're dealing with. I was thinking about like the way that people approach the utilities and things like that, and that concept of like, these prepaid minutes, almost like everything seems so much like you're making collect calls and you're doing all these things in which like the clock is ticking, like the electric bill is running every single second. And you spoke about that yourself, like with growing up and being like somebody who's always like turning the lights off and telling you like how much power we're using and all these different things, and how, obviously that's still a thing. Like, don't just leave your lights on. But at the same time, like we're not dealing with the same, like coming out of the 1980s where every single car weighed 4 tons and gasoline was like sprouting out of every single orifice that somebody had, like people were just like wasting resources to the extent that like nothing was efficient. Nothing was, your refrigerator was like, don't leave the door open, you're gonna destroy the house.
Right.
Fridges are more efficient than that now. Like if you leave the door open, it will beep at you, or like,
it'll talk to you.
The light will turn off and you'll notice, oh, the light turned off, I'll close it. Whereas like, I grew up with a mother and a fridge and a grandmother who grew up with a Frigidaire icebox, you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
like my interaction with the technology, even as simple as a refrigerator, is different than somebody who was born again in 2000,
Yeah.
where you know, you're at that point looking at LG fridges starting to come out and things like that. And that's like, there was an LG 5 years before that. They didn't exist as like a big like technological company and
Yeah.
technology, I guess.
It's definitely interesting. I just find what's so interesting about folks' position kind of in the birth in the early 80s is just this, again, that thinking about bridging these gaps, like, and how I sort of define my own coming of age. And another way for that is, again, I kind of think of it in terms of like dating relationships and things, but like, making a CD for somebody, things like that. And maybe now it's the equivalent is maybe like, oh, I made you a Spotify playlist, which like takes 3 seconds. I don't know.
Right.
But
Like, I don't know. Would you even
there's
do that
something
for somebody?
about, yeah, I don't know. Like there's something about, either if you'd made a tape or a CD, like it took a certain amount of effort, like a lot, to do some of these things. I don't know. I just kind of
Well,
just,
everything did in that way.
yeah,
Like you had to write letters to people and stuff like that. Like, you know,
yeah,
I think about that a lot in terms of how we do business and how easy it
hmm,
is to connect with people. Um, like this is futuristic, really, and
yeah,
only in an imagination 50 years ago. And like I'm saying, like I'm influenced by people who were living 50 years ago.
right, right,
So to me, being born in the 80s, born in 83, again, it's like a real serious bridge
yeah,
because I'm influenced by people for whom this was science fiction, and I'm influencing people for whom I've always known this was coming
right, right,
because
right.
we were born when we were born, and with a certain awareness for like what was on the way, I guess.
And what's interesting, and I don't know who out there decides what these cutoffs are for generations. Like I don't
Mm.
know who's making these
Right,
decisions.
right,
Like,
right.
but I would think that because technology is progressing so exponentially,
Mm.
um, that you almost have to shorten the time frame.
Mm.
Otherwise, because like having these 20-year time spans almost is like too big,
Right,
because
right, right.
even within, we, again, speaking about our own generation, Gen Y or millennials, I don't necessarily feel like I have a ton in common with a 25-year-old. I have some things in common with 25-year-olds, don't get me wrong, but as a 37-year-old with some of the, again, sort of the experiences I had growing up, the things I had access to or didn't have access to, and how things were changing is very different. So, kind of as I was looking at this sheet, this breakdown, I'm like, whoever's responsible for making these decisions, I think needs to tighten up like the
Mm-hmm,
time
mm-hmm.
frame,
Right, right.
because things are changing so rapidly. That you start to feel a little bit more disconnected even by decade.
Mm.
And obviously these time frames span longer than a single decade.
Right,
So
right.
that's kind of interesting for me too, because just things are happening so quickly, technologically speaking. And I'm not a technophobe. Like I don't want people to think that I'm anti-technology or otherwise. It's just, I think anybody, you are certainly, every single person has something that they have some kind of nostalgia for, especially when it comes from your childhood or your adolescence or your coming of age. Um, that's so important to each one of us.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think about like who do I know that was born in '97 that I've interacted with on like on an intimate level. Like who do
Yeah.
I know who was born in 2000? That's like who are the 21-year-olds that I know right now, and like what influence do they have on me? Like it's wild that you say what you just said as far as like the way that you can choose to go, because for me I feel like a lot of my revitalization as an individual came from engaging with people who were on the younger end of my spectrum of generation. You know what I mean? Like I started hanging out with more kids that were born in the 90s, and in the late 90s, you know, mid 90s, I guess, like 90 between 90 and 96, you know.
Yeah.
And if we look at like a lot of the influence on the music that we talk about now, a lot of those folks were born in the 90s at this point. You know, like you see people that are making a major shift in culture that were born in 1996, you know what I mean?
Right.
And they have
or
access
later.
to that there's a certain level of freedom that came with generation, what'd you call it, Generation Z, you know, because if we're
Yes, after
Generation
us.
Y,
Yeah.
then there's a certain level of freedom that comes with Generation Z. Like the you know, South American apartheid is over, right? So you have the Berlin Wall is gone, you know. So you have these remnants of this violent culture that, you know, they kind of can smell the smoke of, but they don't really know that so much, you know what I mean? And like for us, because I was thinking about this reality about our generation, it's like we're the generation where like No Means No came out on television. Before that, everybody was getting their ass slapped and women were getting raped constantly on TV. And like, so that's like, we grew up with this certain level of atrocity left over from the previous generation, you know, and we talk about heavy stuff like that from time to time, as far as like the way that the world really was in the 60s and what people were fighting so hard for in the 60s into the 70s, and, you know, what people were fighting, what fighting against progression looked like in the 80s. You know what I mean? What progression looks like in 2021 is a long, hard fight, you know, a long fought win. Like all these wins that we're having right now progressively are like majorly hard, long fought wins, you know. And we are across the generation, you know, like we were born in 83. AIDS was like new. Like it was like a thing on TV that they were like AIDS. And it's not that it was new, but it was so big now it's in the mainstream.
Yeah.
You know, so they're like, we grew up with that stuff on TV, or this is your brain on drugs.
I was going to say the DARE programs.
I mean? Yeah, DARE programs, exactly. Things like that. So you had like, you know, we grew up on after school specials when you talk about that. You know, there wasn't like a Lifetime channel. There were like 6 TV channels. Right. And one of them saw a point to put on at 3:00 in the afternoon when we got home from school. You can get too drunk or you can fuck your life up. Yep. You know what I mean? And like our parents' generation were drinking fucking whiskey or beer or whatever they were doing. Like their parents were drinking all the time, all day long. Like that was like the only thing you saw was like drink and smoke and
smoking.
And like we're gonna supply you with these different ways to like, I don't know. I don't want to get too hard into that, because this generation is definitely heavy on drugs and drink and everything like that is even to the max more than it was then, because you have everything that they had then, plus all the shit that younger generation after generation continue to come up with. So you have like now this idea of being turned, whereas then the idea of being turned was just like, I don't know, a lot of cocaine or something. I don't know what people did to like really go super wild back then.
The Four Loko just came to mind, but
oh, I'm not talking about our generation. I'm talking about like the previous generation, because I'm wondering like how as an adult, like what was the mentality of a 36-year-old mainstream person, the previous generation from me? You know what I mean? Not just like my sister, the previous generation, but like the beginning of my sister's generation, like that person who was 36 years old, like the parents that were giving birth to Generation X, you know, what
boomers.
Was influencing them?
Right? Would those be the boomers?
The boomers, exactly.
And the boomers are also our parents too.
Yeah, right? My father's a baby boomer for sure. I don't think my mother is. She was born in 55.
Well, let me see. I have a handy dandy worksheet here.
That's awesome.
Technically, the baby boomer generation spans from 1946 to 1964.
Oh, that's crazy.
So yeah, that's what I mean. Like these, they're a couple of decades, and if we just think about, you know, that's a lot of time, right?
You know what it is? Time does this donut thing. where instances happen and generations speed forward in the way that we interact with the world as individuals. So like you mentioned 9/11, I think about 64, like, you know, the fact that the baby boomers lived long enough to start getting drafted, like that generation was long enough that like the ones who started that generation born as like the children of war heroes turned war heroes wherever they were fighting from all over the world. But they lived long enough to start a whole nother war where people were just getting killed, kill, 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 kill. And then if that generation starts in the 60s, that's where Generation X starts. It's like
it's, you know, so generation, it's totally blowing my mind. It's wild. So technically Generation X is between 65 and 80.
Right. So Generation X, they're born in segregation. That's still U.S. segregation. That's still Jim Crow lynching remnants law. That's Black people trying to fight for like the right to have a house without getting firebombed.
Absolutely.
In a new territory, just about, you know what I mean? Like,
well, and also, and to that point, it really puts in perspective, like how far we haven't come when we try to really remove ourselves. Like, oh, things were so long ago.
Right.
No, they weren't.
No,
they weren't. And you know, again, we have brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers, grandparents that are still living,
right?
That have so I just have to say too, whatever this document that I was looking at, it began with what is called the silent generation, and I have no idea where that name comes from. So if people want to send us fan mail and let us know. But the silent generation, 1928 to 1945, I just have to put out there that my grandmother is about to turn 104. She's still alive. Bless her soul. She's not even included. She's a decade older than the silent generation. So I don't even know what she's part of.
Do they have a generational name for her? Huh?
I don't, I gotta look that up.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But again, we have people walking this earth. I think the point is that I think to make ourselves feel better, or at least, I'm only speaking from a cis white female perspective right now. I think to make ourselves feel better, we try to push a lot of things off. Like, it happened so long ago. We have moved so far. We have made so much progress. Look at all of the things that we've done. I mean, it doesn't, look at your own family. You know, who's still alive? What was their childhood like? What was, you know, no, we haven't.
Right. No, not
we
at all.
really haven't. And especially, you know, it's really interesting for me to just kind of see these groupings and these numbers kind of on paper and really like speaking loudly. And, you know, I have a brother in the Gen X category. He's a 1972 baby, and he's got 3 kids of his own grown, or one is in his 20s, which I'm like, how did that happen? Right. And so it's just, I don't know. My head just kind of pops off when you really start to kind of think about, right. You know, right now, if I don't have any children, let's say if I decide to have a child, these cousins are going to be 20 plus years apart in age. Wow. A lot of shit went down.
Right.
You know, it's just interesting how they're, you know, how they're going to relate. You know, especially at the, again, sort of at the speed of sort of these technological changes, you know, where I even find myself like, TikTok, I don't know how to do that. And again, I'm not that old and I'm not that incompetent, but it is just, it's pretty incredible, you know?
Well, that's what I mean too, is like, being where we are on the cusp is the reality that you still have the generational experience to look it up. You know, like if you want to know what TikTok is, we could figure it out by the end of the conversation and throw up our first TikTok, you know, and see what we do with it, because it's like everything is still at our fingertips if we engage again with the younger end of our spectrum. Now this person must have been born in like 92, and it was their little brother. So he must have probably been born in like 96, 97, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in Cali, in San Diego, and we're sitting out back of this person's house, and we're trying to figure out how to put the castanets on our fingers, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's like an authentic pair of castanets, you know. And so I'm like figuring out what's the best finger to put it on, so on and so forth. And this younger brother comes around the corner and he's like, "What are y'all doing?" And I was like, "You know what? I'm trying to figure out these castanets, like exactly how to play them." And he pulls out his phone and he's like scrolling, and well, just puts them on his fingers. Ta, 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 ta. Yeah, you got a phone, you know? It's like just like that vibe to me.
Yeah.
And I was living here at the time, like East Calais, and this was in 2016, maybe. So even that much farther back with like East Calais cell phone technology 5 years ago is probably not what it is now still.
Yeah.
And so like I wasn't used to using my phone for random shit like that. Like, you know, I'm more of a computer generation, like a laptop, you know. Like if I was still like interacting with most of my media through my laptop, like not even really interacting with my media through my phone, because the majority of my phone time existence, I didn't have any type of media to interact with on it. My phone screen was this big or whatever, and like what video am I really going to watch on it, and how much am I going to YouTube? If I YouTube something, I'm going to open my laptop and YouTube it. But like this generation, us now, is like, why would I open my laptop to go onto YouTube? I could YouTube while we're having this conversation, and then I'm here and talking to you, and not telling you how to do it now. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so in that moment, that kid really made me realize that. You know what I mean? And I was like, oh damn, like you're right. Like you have a cracked screen phone. I have a new phone in my pocket, like a new smartphone. I could have taken that out. How do I use the castanets? Like I use a laptop. I know enough to know that I can do that. I have the app on my phone, but I don't have the length of interaction and time with it that I know that that's in my pocket to do that until that kid pulls it out. Now, later on that trip, we're riding our bike through some neighborhoods coming down, and we kind of end up getting up in the hills, and we're trying to figure out like how do we get back down to the coast. And there were some workers working, and you know, we stop and ask like a worker, like a contractor, "Hey, how do you get back down to the highway or whatever?" And he's like, "Oh, you got your phone?" And I was like, "Yeah, I got my phone." I give him my phone, and he's like,
"Oh, type in an address?"
And I'm just like, I have it in my pocket. Like I have the map in my pocket. All I did was pull the map out of my pocket and give it to you, and you have the map in your pocket.
But again, you know what? Again, that makes me think of, you know, when I was in college, I was printing out MapQuest directions.
Exactly. So that's my whole point. Is like I remember going to see like College Girlfriend with like MapQuest written on the
printed
back
out
and like my specific thought directions on the back of the picture of the map. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this dude was in his 50s.
Yeah.
The second guy was in his 50s. Now, because he lives in a place where maybe he has some kids, maybe he's interacting enough, like his place is fast paced enough that the technology that he's interacting with entails the fact that he's got a smartphone in his pocket for a reason. Like they made the smartphones for a reason, and maybe his life just calls on existing with it. Whereas like even 5 years previous to that, as a contractor, my phone was like a chirp phone, you know, like one of the Nextels that you press the button on.
Oh
you
yeah.
know? Or like you remember when I watched The Matrix at some point not too long ago, and remember when that sliding phone was like a brand new technology. Those flip phones were like small phones, and Blackberries and stuff were such brand new technology that.
Oh my God, I had a Blackberry.
Did you? You see that there again, my sister had a Blackberry, but I didn't. I was born too late. I wasn't influenced enough. So for you, it's interesting to hear us talk about this conversation too, because for you lean a lot closer towards the older end of our spectrum.
Yeah.
Whereas like there was a point in time when I decided like the older end of our spectrum is not as turned as like the younger end of our spectrum, and I started leaning that way. And you know, like not just turn in the sense of, well, the reason why kids are so much more turned is because they have freedom.
Yeah.
You know, like people aren't just smashed up for being fun. You know what I mean? Whatever.
Right.
And so many fun things were so damped. And then the next generation kind of took them a while to realize it. Like I think about the things that my parents learned from me. Like my father was a pretty hip dude, but it's because he had interaction with his wife's grandchildren, and they, you know what I mean? So like he had interaction with them from when they were born in the 80s to the 2000s, and you know, watch them with their technology, watch them take what they could take and do what they did with it. So again, I think it's, if we can look at where we interact, then we can really kind of like weave these generations together. And this is all coming from two people who also didn't grow up in a household with like great grandparent, parent,
Right.
and child, where people just have an unbroken understanding of what's going on, place and time, because they grew up with those stories of their folks telling them, this is where you are in time. Like you're not trying to figure it out.
You said something really interesting kind of during at the beginning of the conversation too, in terms of siblings and who influences your household in general. And you know, my brother is 12 years older than I am, and I was heavily influenced by him, especially musically. I idolized him, you know, as a 10-year-old. He was in college, and so he would come home from college, and like he went to college in Boston, and he was just really into house music and techno, and so he would bring that home. And it's just kind of funny when I think about what I listen to and what I love to play in my spin classes and things like that. They are completely, that part of my music taste is so heavily influenced by my brother. And and I just get so lit up. But it was because he would come home, and I just thought, like, my brother is so cool. Like, he's going to clubs, and this is what he's dancing to, and this is the scene. And you know, I just wanted to be like him. So I was like, all right, I got to listen to, you know, CNC Music Factory and Black Box and like, and Snap and all that stuff, and like getting down to it. So it's really funny how our siblings can just kind of rub off on us for what, you know, all kinds of reasons. And I think about that. But yeah, it's interesting to hear you say, you know, being influenced by those younger than us, kind of in our generational category and in that spectrum. And I guess when I think about who relationally I have contact with that is younger, I would say a lot of my colleagues, people that worked with me at Rev. You know, we had a lot of college students working with us, and so I'd like to think that we had a pretty healthy range. It aired on the young side, but you know, folks that were working with us at the studio were age range 17 to 40.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that was pretty cool. Like, I mean, it was a good vibe, you know. What probably the median age was early 30s, I would think. Or maybe that's even, I'm on the older end of the spectrum, so maybe that's being too generous. Maybe it was more like late 20s, and I just don't want to admit being like one of the older ones. But I also do think that I don't know, the whole you're only as old as you feel kind of a thing. I mean, I certainly don't feel like some kind of dinosaur at all. You know, and I'd like to think that, you know, we're setting trends at this age, even so. But it is, yeah, it's interesting to think when you're, you know, influenced by other musicians that are younger than you, or even just or athletes. I feel like as I got older, I remember, okay, here's what I'm thinking of. I remember watching like March Madness as a college student, and I'm watching my peers, right? When you're watching NCAA, if you are collegiate age, like, you're watching your peers play basketball. And then at some point it started to dawn on me, like, oh, now these players are younger than me. It's like that moment when you start to realize culturally, like, okay, I'm not the same age as those players now. Now they're younger than me. Now they're 5 years younger than me. Now they're 10 years younger than me. Now they're 15 years younger than me. And I don't know, it's just this moment. And I'm no fear of getting old. In fact, I fucking love it. But it's just really interesting if you can take something like, when you think, again, something for as easy for me to relate to is like NCAA basketball, like an institution like March Madness that's going to like, obviously COVID kind of screwed that, but something that's just so institutional and so cultural, and you start to kind of relate to it in a different way. Like at one point I was looking up to those people, like, oh man, look at those big guys, they're in college, to like, oh, okay, yeah, they're still big guys, but now I'm the same age as them, to like, oh man, that kid's 19.
Right.
I don't know. Right. Just something like, do you think of anything like that where you're just, it like suddenly dawns on you that you're like, oh shit, I'm 15 years older than that person. And it might not have, and not necessarily in a bad way, but it just kind of like hits you like, oh shit.
Well, I think that I don't feel like somebody who's 20 years old or 21 years old. I don't know. I don't know. That's an interesting question, because if you would have asked me that and I was just like, oh, this is my opinion about that, without like having this whole dialogue previously, I would have said that somebody who's 21, 22, 20, like they don't really feel that much younger than me when I think about myself comparatively.
Yeah.
But when I ask myself, like, who are those people in my life? Like, they're like I think about like my brother's girlfriend's kids, you know what I mean? And I'm like, yeah, that's not my peer. Like, that kid's not necessarily my peer, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But I don't, we live in such a peculiar time period where we have access to so much of the same stuff. Like, everything is so level now, you know? So where before there was a big difference between 36-year-olds and 20-year-olds. Like, to have a 20-year-old who was already really successful, or like Doogie Howser, right? To have like a 20-year-old who was like something that was more adult than they should have been.
That's a cultural reference too, by the way.
Right. Doogie Howser.
Right. Exactly. Neil Patrick Harris, for folks that aren't as old as we are.
Right. But here's the interesting thing about it. Like, because Neil Patrick Harris is still so famous.
Correct. Yes.
You know, so that's the weird, interesting thing about generations. And I was thinking about it when you were talking about basketball and March Madness, because it made me realize, like, oh yeah, that's right. I remember being in the 6th grade during March Madness and like being excited about what was going on. You know what I mean? Like, as a middle schooler, looking up to these college basketball players. And then, you know, I wonder who those college basketball players were when I was 13 years old and I was watching, or when I was 16 years old or whatever, and I'm watching ESPN or something, and I'm seeing NBA stars talked about, like, who was actually in college then when I was, because I wasn't engaged in it. It's a vibe. And so then I asked myself, like, now, well, those folks are like retired. Like, I remember being a kid and Charles Barkley looked young. Like, I remember when Charles Barkley played for the 76ers, I guess, you know? But now Charles Barkley's still like obviously relevant person.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? In the mainstream. And so you watch these like morphologies happen of this must be wild for like a person like your great grandma or your grandma or anybody else who's in the older generations to watch these puffs. Like, somebody watched like Jimi Hendrix become new, get huge, and then die. You know, like, they saw the whole thing happen, and then they saw like the world after and the world before. Whereas like when we live within the generation, within the now, it's only conversations like this where we step back and we be like, oh yeah, like, what does, like, I think about being a teacher and teaching kids that were young. And then I think about where they are now. Like, some of the kids that I was like a camp counselor for or whatever, who are like 27 now, or about to be 30, or like just had their 30th birthday. And so that, again, it because I was 19 and they were 6, it was a whole different perspective. Or let's say that they weren't even 6. Let's say I was 19 and they were like 14. You know what I mean? Because of the way that everything is in the structure of, you know, hierarchy or whatever, like they were young. Like, they were my charges. Like, they were younger. You weren't peers to me at all. You're 14 years old. I'm 20 years old or whatever. But by the time I'm 30 years old, you're 24, you know? And by the time I'm 40 years old, you're 34. You're a complete professional.
Right.
Now. So like, but is that kid still my generation? You know what I mean?
All right. I have a question. Can you, and we can both speak on this, some like a moment, couple of moments, what have been some pivotal things, markers for you of the last 38 years that are either generation defining or And obviously speaking on behalf of yourself.
Right.
Like what do you connect with?
I'll just kind of go run down the line, starting back when I was a baby, like not smoking everywhere, like everything, there not being smoking in everywhere, airports, restaurants,
You remember
hospitals.
like really noticing that shift?
Oh yeah, like I remember when there were like no more cigarette machines anywhere, and like the old pull cigarette machines, those old ones. Like I remember when they weren't anywhere. I remember when cigarettes cost $1, and I remember when they changed them to $4, and now who knows how much cigarettes cost. And so, like for me, that's a pretty, we were born at the end of the smoking generation for the most part. As far as like how cool Lucky Strikes were for people to smoke, that candy cigarettes and the ice cream men and stuff like that. Like, so that like cigarettes was a major one. Then tapes, like tapes not being a thing anymore.
Like VHS or cassette?
Cassettes. I was talking specifically about cassettes.
Yeah.
But when you think about VHS, like Blockbuster and Arrows, like not existing anymore, like I was that VHS on a Friday night.
Oh yeah.
In 3 movies, I was that go to Tower Records and buy 4 tapes and then a pack of Maxwell 90 minutes and go home and record, you know what I mean? But I remember recording over Purple Rain as an 8-year-old, sticking toilet paper in the little sockets so that the recorder would catch it and record over it with the radio, or me and my brother like screaming into a microphone on a boombox, like a boombox.
Yep.
I remember when they put CDs on boomboxes. Yep. And
the
like
top.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, oh shit, this is a CD player and a tape player, like, and so like that was a major moment. The technology on buses, like when buses started talking.
Yep.
You're at Pine Station. Ding. Doors opening. Like I remember that shit.
That I feel like that speaks to your experience, probably DC, Maryland, because I'm like talking buses. This Vermont girl.
Right.
Talking buses? They have talking buses. Where?
Everywhere. All the buses talk everywhere now. It's like an old technology. That was.
Oh my God, did I miss that?
That was like 2000. That was like 99, 98, 99 is the first time I heard of. I was like a 16-year-old, like stoned kid in Pine Station. I was like, what the?
Freaking out.
We live in the future now. Like I was bugged out like that. So I remember that was major. But then, like 9/11 happening in 2001.
Yeah.
I remember what life was like before that. Like that was like the first time that I ever went out of the state and had a solo experience, was going to like Connecticut from DC in the summer of 2001. And so like I remember what it was like going to Port Authority before. And I remember what it was like going to Union Station before and the Grand Central Station, because it was so imprinted on me that like this is my first time in Grand Central Station. Wow. And so the next time that I went, and it was totally subdued and like there was nothing going on, I was like, whoa, this is completely different. And had
you flown before 2011?
Yeah.
Do you remember the difference between air travel?
Absolutely, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a big one. Huge.
Well, see, for me, as well as a subway kid, like, and going through these cities that had subways, like the military being in the subway, heavy police force, like the security guards all of a sudden being Homeland Security. Like Homeland Security wasn't a thing when I was 15. It was a major thing by the time I was 19. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So, well, the department was created post 9/11. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I say like watching the security guards at the mall become Homeland Security officers, like that's what we saw, literally. Like I had a friend who was just the mall security. You'd walk between the mall and the metro station, and when they invented the Department of Homeland Security, they opened up applications for everybody, and people that were like literally the mall guard all of a sudden had to like roll with the Department of Homeland Security. And so, like talk about a shift in time all of a sudden, like talk about a morphology of the world all of a sudden, like you watch some things explode, and then within a year's time period, everything looked different. Like there were soldiers all of a sudden where there weren't
TSA
soldiers before. Exactly. TSA, yeah, it wasn't a thing.
wasn't a
TSA
thing.
wasn't a thing.
No.
The fuck?
I mean,
That's crazy.
I had only been on an airplane a handful of times before 9/11, but I definitely remember, like, you know, whether or not you had a ticket, even in our popular culture, you know, you'd watch movie like Home Alone, one of my favorite Christmas movies. I watch it every year. But you think about like running to the gate, you know, think of how, you know, that was commonplace. You know, you could literally run to the gate, like holding onto your ticket. You didn't fucking go through.
You didn't have to go through
85 lines and pat downs and shit. You know, it's interesting to think like, how do you make Home Alone today? You know, you're waiting in line for your body scan.
Lose your kid, like it's got a phone on them.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting. Like that is such an important piece of culture, I feel like.
Yeah. And that after that, everything was different. You know, it changed the way we did all the things that we did because you know, the culture of the world was different. You have these subdued things, truly. Like you have these moments where like the old party was over and here's the new world, and then we're gonna figure out how to live in the new world, and then we're gonna party in the new world, and then the party's over now for a little while, and then you gotta figure out how to party in the new world, and then party's over. So like, you know, a major thing of like living through COVID, that's the same.
Just thinking that.
The same reality.
Just thinking that.
We're gonna be able to tell the kids will tell their predecessors or their successors, like, yeah, I remember when people didn't really use respirators or nobody was wearing masks all the time, you know?
Right.
And like now it's a common thing. You probably always got a mask on you or some sort of like air purifying, like you don't have a napkin in your pocket anymore. People don't carry handkerchiefs anymore, you know, like stuff like that. Or remembering there wasn't hand sanitizer everywhere, just at the hospital or something like that, you know?
Right.
And like what about you? I'm curious as to like, what are some of the more pivotal, like life shifting moments in technology and mainstream culture?
Yeah. I think about, you know, definitely I have very clear memories of getting my first email address and that being like a thing. s_diggity at hotmail.com. Email me, y'all. It might still be active. That gives you any idea of how cool I thought I was. But I believe I was really into no diggity, no doubt. So I can. Here's the worst part now is people can see your reactions. If you're just listening, I'm getting made fun of. That's what's happening right now. Yes. All right. This is a safe space and I feel safe with all of you.
It's totally safe. It's shocking because for me, it's you represent a part of the same. You're my contemporary, but we had like I didn't have an email until I was already 19. You know what I mean? Like I didn't interact with the technology in the way that it was presented to us. Like I didn't have an AOL. I didn't have any of that stuff. So it's interesting. I
think that was my AOL handle as well. So I do, you know, I remember having that, you know, the dial-up sound to get online, feeling like, you know, we talk about this sort of freedom of interaction and things like that, like feeling this sort of freedom, like stepping into adulthood, like, whoa, I can talk to this person. And I remember like PSAs on chat room danger, like watch out because there's pedophiles everywhere and they're in chat rooms. Like I just kind of remember that being part of my coming of age because I was an adolescent. I was like, oh my God, there could be like scary people in chat rooms and asking creepy questions, you know, and I didn't have any adverse experiences, but I remember I was somebody, you know, I got my license when I was 17 and my folks didn't have money. I didn't get a car or anything. I got my first car when I was a sophomore in college. So it was kind of like a little bit late bloomerish for a rural kid who didn't really have access to buses. So, you know, I was like hitting up friends for rides and just super codependent on parents or friends to get around anywhere. And likewise didn't get my first cell phone until I was a freshman in college. Definitely people had cell phones before that, but that was just kind of the way my family did things and the way that we did it. But just kind of remembering that. Facebook, for me, is really salient because Facebook dropped when we were in college, or when I was in college. So I think Facebook dropped in 2000 and I'm gonna get this right, 2005, I think. And I remember that it was first a network for colleges and universities, which made it really like exclusive, left a lot of people out of that of access. But I remember as a college student, like waiting. It's like word got around, like, is your college like next on the list? It's kind of like for anybody that's waiting to get an invite to Clubhouse right now. If you've heard of like Clubhouse, it was kind of like that. Like, oh, are we going to get invited to this social network? Literally, like, what is this thing? And I remember just back in college, it literally just being like, I'm going to the dining hall. Like, just kind of stuff like that.
Okay.
And then thinking of the juggernaut that it is today, and how things have changed there. So that was big. Yeah, like same 9/11. I distinctly remember, and I don't know if anyone else has a memory like this. I distinctly remember how news coverage and news media changed. Because I remember suddenly being very glued to my television set, being very glued to cable news coverage. And this whole like, yes, the cable news has always been like fear, like, everybody's got to be afraid of everything. And here's all the scary things you need to watch out for. Like that's what sells. And that's how we keep people down. But I remember distinctly like that going into that 24-hour news cycle. And I remember like those tickers at the bottom of the screen just constantly. So it was like sensory overload. Like I'm being shown an image. I've got the commentator talking about it. And then I've got like breaking news briefs 24/7, like tickering across this, I was going to say across the stage, essentially across the stage. And that visually wasn't how news was before. And now, like, I mean, I can't even watch cable news now, thank God. But like if I give in and I do tune on to something, or I put something on YouTube or watch a clip, it's like everything is breaking news.
Right.
Okay. It's just this like, again, just this heightened sensationalistic thing. And I really, really, really remember like getting this feeling, like an ominous feeling, like shit, like that. I don't think this is good. Like, I don't think this is good for anybody. And that just felt different. And I was 17 or 18 feeling that way. Like, I don't like this feeling. I don't like what's being thrown at me, or like how it's being packaged. I don't know about you. Definitely, one thing that comes up in some of the literature for what we're supposed to consider as big in our generation is the Great Recession of 2008. I don't know. I was in grad school at the time, but I was living what defines things more for me is probably the election of Barack Obama happening in 2008. But also coincidentally, like that economic crash also happening. And I was living in New York City at the time. So like every third person that I was meeting, I'm like, I'm in a new city. This is really exciting. We just elected Obama. And every third person I was meeting was like out of a job.
Wow. Yeah.
Like it was pretty impactful. So I was like, oh shit, I guess I'm lucky to be in graduate school. It was just there was an interesting energy about that city then in particular, especially because, Wall Street and real estate was just like on fire. And that is so much of like that New York scene. So, it was just,
Right.
That's a lot to chew on.
No, I think about I think about how the lifestyles that we lead dictate what impacts us in our generations. You know what I mean? Like, even what you just said about Facebook coming out in 2005, like I wasn't engaged with it personally until, probably 2010, 2012, you know what I mean? but when I think about like where was I in 2005, like I was just off in the hills somewhere, by then, like wandering in Hawaii or in Costa Rica or living up in Worcester or something like that. So um I think I specifically unplugged for a certain amount of time after 2001, just because there was a certain amount of stuff that happened when 9/11 hit that was kind of like crux moment for anybody who had already been kind of watching the way that government policy was starting to turn, and had already kind of had their mind turned towards like the Big Brother concepts and things like that. And so when that happened for me as a young adolescent, 19, 18, 19, it was a perfect opportunity to just be like, oh, let's just live simply somewhere where if they start a draft and I don't want to get drafted, I don't have to get drafted. Like,
that's
you
right.
know, I'm going to fly to Hawaii and stay there for 2 months. I'm going to go try to get to Costa Rica for a few months. I'm going to get up to Vermont where it's close to the border just in case, you know, because if I'm like an A1, I'm going to try to get to Montreal, you know, stuff like that
I
is like
almost
on my
forgot
mind as a
about that.
19-year-old because I didn't go to college. So for me, I was in a very different place coming out of high school. In like I graduated in 2002. Did you graduate in 2001?
No, I'm 2002.
Wow, yeah.
grad.
See, I was held back. As my birthday's in January, I should have graduated in 2001.
Okay, right.
But so by the time I graduated in 2002, I was already, my mentality was out of high school. Like I was already, the day after I graduated, I got on a bus to New York City and ended up, I slept in Connecticut that night, you know, like I was already, my mind was already where I was going to be 4 months from now in Washington State. Like, and so when 9/11 happened and the world started changing, all the security culture around like, is shit gonna get locked down all of a sudden? Like, you know, when 9/11 happened, I'm like a Muslim in DC. Like, I don't know if it's gonna look like that movie The Siege with Bruce Willis and Denzel Washington. Like, if I don't know about it, you should check it out. Like, because it was a movie that was made pre 9/11 that had a lot of foreshadowing of what happened after. You know, and you know, if you had old enough people or you were reading certain newspapers, or I was in DC, so I have access to everything. And so the newspapers that you're reading are alternative newspapers. If the bookstores are going to are alternative bookstores, then you know you're reading about all sorts of different things that define the time that you're in. So when two buildings blow up and they're like, now everybody's got to register and section this and that, blah blah blah. And I was like, man, fuck that. Like, I'm gonna move to Vermont where it's kind of quiet and I can just go up there and just float around a little bit. I know that, you know, it's not a major hub. Like that's how I started thinking, was like, it's not a major hub where things are gonna turn sour if they do turn sour. And so much of that defined where I was by 2005, 2008. I started North Country Kettlebells in 07. So like you talk about the recession and people talk about it, but for me, like I was already at such a starting point of me. Like everything was a climb up at that point. So by 2012, you know, people were like I had a business, like it was sustaining me. And so it almost didn't notice that it even happened. And I remember telling friends of mine, because we were aware that it was going on. I was telling friends, you know, like we just have to keep building what we're trying to build so that by the time it's over, we can have something that's sustainable for us. But it made a lot of my friends make sense out of not going to school and things like that or whatever. So yeah, it's just interesting. That's a long-winded way of saying it's very interesting to see how your experience is differs from mine based on not just where we came from, but what we did at the same time. Like both having graduated in May or June of 2002, then where we by June of 2003 was very different. And that was a time period where everything was dictated kind of by where you were.
Well, and that's really interesting. Again, like with these events happening and where you are and how that placement of where you are, like literally physically, you know, has those effects. So for example, like I was a first year on a college campus when President George W. Bush said, we're going to go and attack Iraq. And I'm like, what the fuck? And being kind of like ripe that young age and being in a politically charged environment, like, I'm like, all right, I guess this is where I start protesting. Like that was that was sort of the beginning of my personal activism in politics, domestic and internationally. And that then, continued on for a solid decade. And I continued to do work. I think I told you this separately, Mujib. I used to intern at the Council for American Islamic Relations. Like, I went to New York City and I interned like it really like informed a lot of my own politics and feelings about Islamophobia in this country. And certainly, us being in countries that we have no business being in and all kinds of things. So it is really interesting at like what the age that we are when some of these things occur and where we are spatially, mentally, what we have access to or don't, like, and even from a gendered perspective, not that a woman couldn't get drafted, but certainly, it's interesting for me to hear you talk about, that possibility for the draft, because now I'm remembering like there was a lot of talk about that potential and possibility. And I'm now remembering, actually, it's like I'd stuffed it somewhere, graduating in 2002 and then having people that I graduated with voluntarily signed up for the military because they wanted to go kick some ass. And I'm like, what the fuck? To me, that was like, are you crazy? No disrespect for folks that served, just my perspective was like, oh, wow. But it motivated a lot of people. A lot of people went into voluntary service during that period of time that are our age.
I know plenty.
Yeah. So yeah, just very interesting again. And that's something that I think I like buried a little bit. hadn't thought about that,
I mean, there's a lot of that. We came out of a specific time. Like the world shifted so hard and has been constantly shifting so hard that it's almost tough to remember what it would have felt like, before that, because not just did times change, policy change, international relations change, but at the same time, technology was changing. And since 2000, technology has flip-flopped 6 times forward, you know what I mean?
Right.
To the point where now, like, our technology is so tiny and so small and so powerful between now and 21 years ago. 20 years ago at this point was what we're talking about. I'm 19, but
right.
But yeah, I mean, and so it's the world's just going that much faster, and the causes are so much more to think about, and we get to see so much more of what's going on in the world too. So now we're like comparing ourselves even more towards what we're doing going forward. There's not as, at least again, it goes back to where are you and what are you doing and who are you and where's your mentality right now? Because my truth isn't the same truth for somebody else who's living somewhere that's much slower, and they're still like, nah, dude, we're still hanging out with our grandmothers, like not trying to just get to the next moment, you know what I mean? Whereas like somewhere else, somebody's like really just, when's the next thing coming out? How am I going to get to this next stage in my life or whatever? Generations, isn't that something to think about? Goodness. Because the conversation could go so many different ways. We could have just talked about Saved by the Bell or like Martin, or Bad Boys, the movie, or like watching the Fresh Prince turn into the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air turn into Will Smith. Like, like talk about evolution.
That is a whole podcast. You can just cover Will Smith.
Right. Whatever the Jazzy Jeff, he's still right there, like people just don't see him as much.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, so much to talk about when it comes to that. Because you think about like, who are some of the people that are famous now that were little kids then?
that were little kids when.
Like you talk about Miley Cyrus sometimes. You never watched Hannah Montana, probably, right?
I didn't watch Hannah Montana,
right?
Yeah,
but she was like a
child
I love her now for the kids. Yeah. So like,
isn't that funny?
For that generation, like it's like people that were fans of Lil Wayne when they were 12. By the time 2010 hit, they were the hypest people in the world because the fucking person that they were a fan of became super famous. So like the kids grew up on Hannah Montana. When Miley Cyrus made Wrecking Ball, they were like, we're lit in the club, chewing their faces off. Like, it's shit in this world is wild. And it's so much less censored now. So you see how much more wild it is. Like, I think if more people knew about what was going on in the 60s and the 40s and the 30s, and 12-year-olds would be trying to mix it up a little bit more. But like, now that you know exactly what's going on at all times, you can jump online and find some computer to figure out whatever else is going on. Student is be in the mix. Like and that's a whole nother podcast to talk about too. Like, what do you think that you would be doing if you were 13 now?
Oh my gosh. Right. I don't know. That is oh man.
Yeah, based on S_no diggity. Like, like who would you be now? Like, what would your viral TikTok be?
I'd be so cool.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
I'd be so cool.
Oh my God, you would be. It's your time. Like this is the age of the Aquarius. Like this is the reason why the world is the way that it is because the wins that were won.
Yeah.
When they were won, like in this country at least, like the world is all sorts of wild everywhere, not just in this country and abroad where bombs are blowing up constantly, but like this is it's different 2021.
It is, and it'll be interesting, obviously COVID being immensely impactful on a global scale, how this event continues to shape everybody's generation, like everybody. And, like you said, always having, a mask in your vehicle or in your purse or in your pants pocket, like, is that something that stays with us? And, likely, how are we, what are we going to be saying 10 years from now about how, this event shaped us and where were we and, what did we tap into? And, I think if anything, technology is allowing us to connect and to be in the same space and place, even when we're not. Right. So, it's really going to be interesting to see how this continues to unfold and impact us, no matter if you're, 80, 60, 40 or 15.
Right.
So I hope I'm around to see it.
Right. Maybe we'd be centurions ourselves.
Exactly.
Like in 2083,
That's the plan. Oh, wow. That's kind of.
Yeah.
That's.
Think about another 50 years. Think about just another 50 years from now, like with innovations, with solutions that are being thought up now, with the 50 years from now, right? Like the next, like, I don't know. You think about who the innovators are and how young they are. Like those innovators still have another 25 years of innovation to happen before they're even born.
Right.
So like, we think about and Prometheus with the fire, what I mean? Like that whole idea.
Yeah.
Like we live in a generation now where like so many people just have the fire now. Like people rushed Olympus and got it and started throwing it on the internet. This is the fire, man. Like you jump on Instagram, people are just like, this is how you can make money this way. This is how you can make money this way. People are telling teenagers like, go and figure stuff out now. Don't wait. Do it now. You have access. You have more access than some completely grown adults in the world. You can be their boss like that. You know what I mean? And so like the way that people have now the fire, the way that we all have the access to it, to whatever much more we have access to now, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Like the whole lies my teacher told me and the people's history of America and the people's history of the United States of America. Like that's curriculum for kids now.
Yep.
Like that wasn't curriculum for us. We had,
right. We talked about, I remember us talking about, like, I had a teacher luckily in high school that gave me a copy of Howard Zinn's book,
right.
But that wasn't the norm. Right. That was kind of like, meet me in the hallway after school.
I could get fired for giving you this book. You know what I mean? I could get fired. Like I could get fired for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's real.
Yeah.
That's real. Whereas now that's the way of the world, You better go learn the truth somewhere. Know thyself.
The truth is out there. I could spend an hour talking about the X-Files because the X-Files was one of my favorite shows.
Oh my God. I remember going from being terrified of the X-Files as a little kid to being like going to see the X-Files movie with my girlfriend in high school.
Dude, that was my show. I already told you all what my first email address was. I also had like Fox Mulder like pictures on my bedroom walls. Yes. I just like a weird. I like all kinds of different things.
You were ahead of your time. David Duchovny is a total sex symbol now.
Yeah, I was so into him when I was 12.
Right. You're an innovator. You saw it coming. You saw the wave coming.
Years before Californication came out, I was like, Fox Mulder is, yeah. Oh my God. Well, God. I think we need to end on that note, because either I made someone puke in their mouth or they're nodding their head. I don't know. We're going to get all ends of the spectrum on that one. And the best part is I can see Mujib's reaction. So that's really priceless for those of you that are watching.
Right. I love it.
Oh, man. Talking authentic. About my generation. Big up to the Who.
Oh, that's right.
This was fun.
Yeah, it was. And it's easy. We could keep going and going and going.
Oh, I know.
This is the longest episode.
This is the longest. We kept people a little overtime, so hopefully you stuck with it. I feel like I need to go write in my journal now. A lot come up for me.
Well, see, I have journals from that time period too. Like I have journals from 2002, like driving my travels around the country, you know, like what I was writing in back seats of cars and on buses and stuff like that. So it's cool to go back and, like, you know, if you ever wrote notes in notebooks or put little things that you wrote in journals or books that you were reading back then, like run through those things. I have a letter from my sister that she wrote me my first year in like a boarding school. I was 16 and she wrote me this letter, and she was 22, you know, and I read it to her the other day. And it's just interesting to see, like, as a 38-year-old now, to read a letter from my sister when she was 22, when I thought she was like the smartest person in the world at that point in time. You know, she was the coolest. She'd been everywhere. And to hear the 22-year-old in her voice, like in her writing, and be like, oh, you're 22 years old. You don't fucking know anything. Like, you just developed, you know what I mean? Like, you're just getting into, like, the floor hasn't even really fallen out from you again yet, you know, and it's gonna. You haven't had your 28-year-old crisis, you know, like all the different, like,
so many crises.
Oh my God, from 22 to now. Oh my.
Yeah. Well, this has been fun. Yeah, as always.
I love it. This is a great one. And that's why this conversation is an easy one to have. And I think that's why we get along so well, because we can just jump down this rabbit hole of, like, all the spectrum of which something as simple as, like, talk about your generation can encompass, you know?
Yeah. And also too, how I love the idea of just getting those different lenses from which, you know, we both lived through 9/11, but, you know, what are, you know, your takeaway is different from my takeaway, or what was the most salient thing out of that. And again, that's why we just need to talk to each other. And, you know, it's just, there's nothing greater than conversation and listening to the experience of others, because you've got to realize that, yes, we are living through the same events, but we are not experiencing those events in the same way or context. Right. And to literally be able to listen to others and, like, oh man, well, how was that for you? You know, and to really, like, listen and hear, you know, what that person says back to you. Oh man, like, you know, so, you know, I guess if anything, if this podcast has any greater purpose than just to amuse the two of us, it's that, folks, that it, you know, people start opening up those dialogues. Cool. All right, everybody. Well, this has been a fantabulous hour plus with y'all. And once again, my name is Sarah.
My name is Mujib.
And I hope you all take care.
Peace out.